Thank you so much for joining us for this afternoon session. And I actually think it's going to be a really exciting session. Today we're taking some time to talk about asset management, the importance of asset management, and the importance of integrating different systems throughout utility companies to really get asset management to work well for this next generation of technologies. So my name is Christine Richards, and again, I'm the research director for Zpryme, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. And we also, unfortunately, William Bell from CenterPoint Energy had to cancel at the last moment, so he wasn't able to join us today. But we do have two great panelists here today. The first is Ian Mcleod, who is the chairman of the Queensland Future Institute on the Energy Committee, as well as Rick Nicholson, who's the head of product marketing and management for ABB Enterprise Software. So thank you for joining us today, gentlemen.
Our pleasure.
Thank you. So what we want to do today is just set the stage first for asset management, why we should be caring about it, and why it's important for the future of energy. And to do that, the way we're going to base a lot of our discussion today is off of a recent research project that's actually being released at this event. ABB and Zpryme, we partnered together to do a research project around IT/OT integration for asset management. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that study, and then we'll jump into some questions and answers with our panelists. So for the study, we wanted to understand, how much of a priority is asset management for utility companies, as well as just more broadly for infrastructure. What are some of the things that are really driving utilities to invest in these areas? And I think through a lot of the conversations you've seen today, that there are a lot of technologies that are out there, whether it's IoT, consumer devices, energy storage, Internet of Things, the list goes on and on. We have all of these devices and assets that are out there. And those need to be managed. How is the industry going to take care of all these assets? And at the same time, we also have all these assets that are starting to bring data back to utility companies. So there are some huge opportunities to really start to use this data to better manage the assets that utilities have. So some of the additional questions that we had that we looked to address in the study were, IT/OT, so information technology and operational technology. Those areas are needing to come together for asset management. So what does that mean from a technology standpoint? And how well are those integrated? And what does it mean from a people standpoint? So this morning we talked about humans and people and the different groups that are involved in making some of these technologies possible. And we're really trying to get a better sense of how integrated do those need to be. So those were some of the questions that we asked. And we went out and asked them to the utility industry. We got about 220 respondents. About 63% were from North America. But we really did get some good representation from Europe, Asia Pacific, Middle East and Africa, just understanding, how are they approaching asset management, and what are some of these challenges that they're facing as they do it. In terms of company size, we had, about half of the respondents had $1 billion or more in annual revenue. So definitely had some good-sized utility companies as well as smaller utilities, so really good representation of the industry. So let's chat about the data.
Okay.
Chat about what's happening with asset management. All right, so what we're going to do is take some of the data points from our study and use that as kind of a jumping off point for a conversation. So let's take a look at the first slide here. So the first slide really takes a look at the importance of asset management. And what we found is that smart grid and all these new technologies that are out there. I mean, it's gotten a lot of buzz over the past few years. But what we're seeing now, and as you can see on this slide, is that asset management is a priority for utility companies. But it hasn't been that way, and we're really seeing that it's definitely been increasing for utilities. So why that change? Why that interest in asset management? Rick, you want to go?
Yeah. Hopefully you can. Is that mic working?
Yeah,
Okay,
you're
good. The chart on the left, to me, wasn't really a surprise. You ask utility executives if asset management is important, and generally they will all say yes, it's important.
Yeah.
So that was just kind of I guess to me, a bit of a stage setter, right? What was much more interesting to me was the second question, the chart on the right, which was how has it changed in importance over the last 12 months? And you can see that 55% said it was more important than it was 12 months ago. So that kind of begs the question, why?
Yeah.
And I think one of you alluded to it in your kind of opening remarks, and that is that for the past, let's say 5 to 7 years, at least here in the U.S. and arguably in other countries as well, smart grid has been kind of the top initiative for a lot of utilities, and there's a lot of reasons for that, but it tended to overshadow kind of other things that were going on in the company. It kind of pushed asset management down in the ranking. It's not that asset management, the importance of it never went away. Yeah. It just got kind of overshadowed by all the spotlight that was on smart grid. So I think that is part of it. But I think what's then interesting to me is that the basic drivers of why utilities would be interested in asset management never went away during that time frame, and they've just sort of resurfaced. So the classic aging assets problem. In utilities in developed countries, you've got assets that are quite old, and that the average age of those assets didn't, it's either stayed the same or they got older during the period we were focused on smart grid. So they didn't just magically become younger assets while we were dealing with smart grid initiatives. So that didn't go away.
Yeah.
The other classic aging problem of an aging workforce similarly didn't go away. I mean, you could argue that due to the recession, that it might have slowed things down. You saw fewer people retiring as early as you might have thought that they would have, but it's still a problem that didn't go away, and there's still a lot of kind of knowledge about those assets and the processes around them that's leaving those companies. And then, more recently, we're seeing an upswing of investment, capital investment in assets, even in a time period where we're seeing retirements of particularly coal-fired generation. We're seeing a lot of new investment now across the board, transmission, distribution, renewables. So there's a lot of new capital investment going in. So that's what I thought was particularly interesting about that, was that change over the 12-month period.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like even though we're putting out a lot of these new technologies, I mean, there are still assets that are out there.
Just to give you an example, so one of our customers, American Electric Power, was presenting at a conference about a month ago, and they quoted some statistics about their power transformers, their fleet, and it's a big fleet of power transformers, that 33% of them were over 50 years old, and 18% of them were over 60 years old. So, I mean, that's a great example of assets that have been in service for a very, very long period of time.
Yeah, definitely. And Ian, what are you seeing?
Well, I'll put a bit of an Australian slant on it, I guess. I'll tell you what I'm seeing in Australia. We've seen most distribution businesses, transmission businesses, more from spending a lot of money on augmentation and integration of renewables and those sorts of things into the grid. But it's true now, Australia's just going through its 5-year regulatory resets, and most of them occur over the past 12 months and next 12 months. And what we're seeing there is it's moved from augmentation to asset replacement. Asset replacement is the biggest investment of all those businesses. And quite frankly, there's converging technology that enables us to do it better than we've ever done in the past. So we have this ageing asset, We have a disruptive technology coming in terms of solar PV, and in Australia, in particular in Queensland, it's got the highest penetration in the world. We've got our customers wanting choice. They're looking to be empowered. They're looking for options. So we're getting a lot of competitive pressure on the entities as well. So it's not just about, well, I've got a lot of money to spend in that space because it's gotten older in the last few years. That's absolutely true, it has. But we've got to bring our costs down, and therefore you need to know what condition your asset is in and where it's at. So you've got to invest in that space. All the big data that's happening, the predictive analytics, those sorts of things can enable us to invest better into asset management. So it's no surprise to me to see that people see that as more important. But can I add to that? From my perspective, when I look at smart grids and distributed energy resources and those sorts of things, they're all connected. Okay, so control of the networks are going to move down into the low voltage and medium voltage networks. I actually have to know what condition that conductor is, how big it is, where spatially it is, how much current I can put through it, how much is coming from the distributed energy resources, what's going to happen when I control hot water, thermal storage, all those sorts of things. When we flip from supply following demand to demand following supply, it's down deep into the network. So you have to understand it. You have to understand it very well. So I think asset management is really, at the end of the day, a combination of the smart grid and transactive energy and all those things. You've got to know your customer, you've got to know where the energy is flowing, you've got to know the assets it's flowing through, you've got to know where it is, and you've got to understand the risk, because it'll be the networks who will switch that.
Yeah.
So I think there's a different paradigm occurring as well. So as well as an ageing asset, the smarter asset and the transactive future means you need to know more.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point, because some of the lessons that we learned when we were applying analytics to transmission scale assets was that, if you had, for instance, to derate a transformer because of some problem with it, you could actually quantify based on where it was in the network and what the prices were and what congestion was on the network. You could kind of quantify the value of derating that transformer. How much money were you going to lose by doing that? And as we move kind of transactions down to the distribution level, you're going to see the same things happening. So I think you're absolutely right that knowing a lot more detail about those assets because of the way that the markets are changing at the distribution level is going to be equally important.
So I think we've talked about it here a little bit. Some of these different technologies, so distributed energy resources, spatial information, the Internet of Things, all these different pieces are starting to come together. How does it change asset management from what utilities have been doing for a long time to, something new? What are going to be some of those key changes that we're going to see?
Well, I'll take a crack at it. As you have more and more kind of transparency into the current condition of an asset. You're putting sensors on more things than you used to. So there's your kind of Internet of Things play into there. There's actually kind of two sides to what you can then do with that additional information. It's not that you can't do a good job of managing assets with limited information. So I like to say that you have to have data. It doesn't have to be big data. But the more data you have and the better the data is, the better job you can do in managing those assets. So on the one side, you can make better short-term decisions if you have better data. And that gets to the point that I think that Ian brought up about predictive analytics. Mm-hmm. Right? So instead of waiting for something to fail and then repairing or refurbishing or replacing it, you can start to predict the likelihood that an asset is going to fail in a certain period of time. And then you can make a judgment call. You can say, oh, well, we're still going to leave it because it's not that critical. Or, oh, yeah, this is a critical asset and we need to now take action earlier than we would have. So that's one side is the kind of the short-term piece. But there's also, I think, a long-term kind of capital planning aspect to it as well. And as you look at how whether it's a 5 or a 10 or even a 20-year view on how you're going to invest your capital and assets, that when you have better data about those assets, you can do a better job of optimizing that investment over a longer period of time.
Excellent. And Ian, what are you seeing in terms of that transformation?
Well, the transformation, I guess, is one thing we're seeing, or where we're going, is we're going to run these assets hotter.
Yeah.
Okay? So we're going to run them hot. We need to know what condition they are, what's the situational intelligence I need from those assets, and what's the degradation rates of the windings and those sorts of things. Because we've now got the technology to do that. We're not putting in all this capacity that we put in before. Only have the global financial crisis to come along, which is called something different here, but when consumption went off and demand went off, our utilisation's gone down. In Queensland and Australia, we've got there's a focus to grow Northern Australia, and I guess one of the things I'm saying is I think we can double population with only 30% investment into the network. And into generation, quite simply because the way the network's utilised at the moment is very inefficient. Spent a lot of time doing tariff reform, controlling these loads. So that's a key message. They're certainly going to be run a lot hotter than they've done in the past. And so you have to know exactly what's happening. You need to know how to manage that risk and how to move those sorts of loads. And with the integration, as I said before, of renewables, we're actually getting situations now, because there's no diversity in supply on the solar PVs, and we're up around 30%. Networks are being built for solar. So that's a different element. The diversity's not quite there.
Yeah.
Well, diversity's not there like there is a load. It's actually supply coming in, and currently we don't control that. So that's a different mindset. As when I deal with our engineers, we ran some innovation challenges in the last couple of years, and I took some of these areas with assets that were under constraint and pretty much said, well, do your problem definitions. What's changing that? Because their response in the past was build more of it, make it bigger, and we'll perhaps do a little bit more on load control and those sorts of things. We did some good stuff there. But when you broaden the horizons and say, look, do your problem definition, understand what the customer segments are, understand what influence they have on the assets, understand the load flows, understand how much distributed energy is on that, understand how much controllable energy is on that grid. And I would say to them, I'd be really happy if you fixed it for nothing. But across 3 projects that were worth about $40 odd million, we saved 26 million in that process, because they got out of the traditional way of thinking around asset management and fixing problems and started to use some of the resources that were available in terms of new technology, LoRa technology, wireless, those sorts of things, getting control out there. So it is that, run the asset hotter, understanding the asset, having the sensors there, putting in your life extension type programs. That's what I see the focus changing.
Yeah, so a lot from, the people side of the house, the way people are approaching asset management, how they're thinking about solving these problems. So yeah, definitely a lot of change happening from many different angles.
Yeah, and who's part of the solution? It could be that we're going to augment we've got a capacity problem somewhere, and as I said, typically put more capacity in or put some demand management in. Well, now we'll put in some hybrid solar with battery, with control, and we'll put a tariff structure in play. So where the engineering groups used to be quite insular, what I started to do was bring in the finance people and the customer service people and even logistics, and then we brought externals, the universities in, and we brought the industry players to just look at these as a problem, whether it's augmentation or asset management, and come up with different ways of doing things.
Yeah.
So I think the profile is increasing.
Excellent. Now, another area we wanted to talk about was, all these different systems, all these different technologies out there. How do we start to integrate that and bring that together for asset management? And that means, being able to integrate IT, OT systems and get a lot of other technologies involved. So let's take a look at some other data that we collected in this study. And you can see here that for the value of IT/OT integration for asset management, utility companies say that that's very valuable to them, to extremely valuable. So there are a lot of efforts going on in this area. And one of the things that we saw as being kind of a kink in some of this IT/OT integration are things like the Internet of Things. So you can see in the other figure, we talked about what's your strategy around IoT for asset management. And you can see here that a lot of utilities they don't have that plan yet, or they're just starting to build that plan. So, there's definitely some work that needs to be done, around how can we start to bring, some of these different technologies together. So the question I had here was just, what are some of the key changes you're seeing around IT/OT integration for asset management? Where are utilities really starting to gain some traction in those areas?
Well, before I answer that, I want to refer to the chart on the left, because
Okay.
that was the second one that really caught my eye. A lot of times when you do, as you know, these types of surveys, you're not necessarily looking for kind of any truly new insight. You're looking for validation of some assumptions that you've made. If you would have asked me how I thought utilities would respond to that question, and you took the top three categories, so valuable, very valuable, and extremely valuable, I probably would have guessed that it would have been in the 50 to 60% range. Well, it's 80%. So that was a little bit of a surprise that it was that high, that the perception was that it was that valuable.
Yeah.
But at the same time, as you pointed out, the reality is that they're not there yet. So that kind of makes you start thinking, why? If the perceived value is that high, why aren't things moving faster?
Yeah.
And I tend to think that, there are some technical barriers, but those are relatively minor compared to the kind of cultural, process, business, regulatory barriers that utilities have to get through to truly integrate kind of the IT and OT sides of their business and the technologies that they use. I think time and again that becomes the larger kind of barrier or roadblock to unleashing the value that they believe is there.
Yeah, so it's not just, if we can just figure out this technology, there are much broader things going on that shape it.
There's plenty of smart technologists around that can figure those things out.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right, yeah.
So
Yeah.
what are you seeing, Ian?
Look, I think people see it as valuable, but what I've seen over the years is that the systems are too cumbersome. We're starting to see, obviously, the merger of IT and OT. For years, they wouldn't talk to each other. So the company I ran before, Ergon Energy, we had a ICT group called Spark. It was shared with Energex, 50-50 owned. I chaired the company. If you have a talk to the asset group and talk about merging those IT/OT functions, there was no way. They do all that. They do all that enterprise stuff. We're the ones who run the network, and so there's a big cultural issue. So while I think a lot of people are seeing it, and people are moving in that space, putting data scientists in and merging the IT/OT groups. It's only just sort of happening, and I think the systems need to be simple. And that's one of those challenges. So we sort of set out trying to replicate the experience you'd have at home. How many people have been trained in the internet? but how many people use the internet to run part of their life, their banking, their holidays, all those sorts of things. They don't have that same experience at work. And you've got to bring that IT, the commercial data, information, the HR data, all that stuff with the actual physical network itself. We had some technology we created in Ergon Energy called ROAMs. It was spatial data. It was an interesting process because the tech guy who put it together came to me and wanted funding. I gave him $500,000 and went and tested it, trialled it, and then we built the whole product, which cost several $1 million more than that. But we saved $40 million, double that on vegetation every year. But the interesting thing was, he said to me, no, we're doing vegetation, which we agreed on. We're just going to give this to the people who manage the contracts.
Yeah. I
said, no, you're not. I said, you're going to give access to everyone in Ergon Energy, 4,500 people. And I was presenting to the board probably 6 or 9 months ago, and the interesting thing was 800 odd users of that information at that stage, because it became operationally valid to them. The supervisor in the field doing their job planning, the contract manager doing the vegetation management, the asset manager, the functions around safety. You know, if there was a safety event, I could just go into the data and see it straight away. So when people feel it providing operational benefit, and they can see, well, you know, that connectivity between IT and the operation is there. This particular guy who did the technology in that space started in the business, was an IT sort of guru. He knew what the problems were and could bring it together. So absolutely, I think IT is going to drive much deeper into these businesses. It's going to be core to the success. And the cultural change will be important.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you think that there's really value of, you know, distributing the asset data and asset management data, I mean, across organizations?
Absolutely.
And I mean, how does that happen? You know, what's the approach?
You and I participated in a webinar just about a week ago where one of the other speakers, I forget exactly the term they used, but it was something like the tyranny of the use case.
Yes,
But what it implied was that, you know, as Ian mentioned, if you only view it as solving a very narrow problem, you don't get that value that you're looking for. It only really just kind of provides the value of a very narrow use case or problem that's trying to be solved. Whereas if your view is that you're going to make this investment and then you make the data available to everybody, that's where you get that kind of ratchet effect of, you know, you're finding value where you didn't even think to look initially, because if you would have done it kind of the typical kind of top-down, define the use case first, you don't find those things. So yeah, and it is a shame that that Bill Bell from Centerpoint, you know, couldn't join us, because I would have held them up as another example of, you know, of a company that has done that in a number of instances and seen quite a bit of value out of it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think something that, in some of the conversations I've been having today, you know, you talked to Ian about some of the user experience and, you know, what people expect from some of the systems that they interact with. And there's, you know, asset management is definitely, you know, the real-time systems and all of that. I mean, that's all mission critical elements. And so how do you make that information accessible to people in an easy way, while, you know, really keeping that mission critical, you know, attitude and making sure that it's easy for people to use?
Well, from my perspective, it can be done today. It is being done. It's we use a global spatial portal to go into the information, and the assets are geospatially located. You can click on the asset, you can see what condition it is, all the inputs that come into that. It's a simple navigational system. So whether it's my customer information, my asset information, my energy information, whether it's my financial information, it provides an easy navigatable system. So many of our, you know, some of our systems are, we have very restricted access to, because it's, they are difficult systems to manage, and you've got to be an expert to do it.
Yeah.
But I would argue that with the technology we've got today, you can make it as simple as I said before, the tools you use at home to navigate, to find out information, etc. It's just about a bigger and more complex business. And that's all coming together.
I mean, I'll kind of maybe point two things out I think that are relevant. One gets back to a lot of organizations really don't even realize how much data they already have.
Yeah.
And how much is wrong?
How much
That's
of
a
it?
whole other
How much is
session around
accurate?
data
How much isn't? And how relevant is it? So I think even before you kind of jump into the once again we can do all this great stuff and tie this data together, you need to almost do an assessment ahead of time and find out what have you got, what don't you have, what are the gaps, then figure out. Okay, now we need to make some improvements. So that's part of the kind of the preparation for getting into then can you get additional value out of all that data. But then this question about you've got some real-time systems, the ones that are mission critical, others that aren't. I mean, we're starting to see approaches using kind of technology that really evolved, I think, in consumer markets to provide kind of internal access to that data, and whether it's a spatial data portal or whether it's a very standard kind of business intelligence tool, and you can just go in and subscribe to the data feeds that are of interest to you and that you have permission to have access to. And literally, I mean, some of this stuff is so incredibly easy to it's just point and click, and it builds dashboards for you, and you can move things around. You don't have to have any programming skills whatsoever. And I think that's the direction we're going to see things move in, is that basically everybody has these really easy tools to access the data. And there'll always be an expert, a data scientist or an analyst that can help out with complex queries. But for the really easy stuff, it's going to be just kind of self-service.
Yeah, giving that accessibility to the information. Now,
and being able to see it all together. So projects, for instance, we would run on an inspection cycle on the assets, which would drive a works program, and behind that you'd have an augmentation program, a customer program, and a reliability program. It's quite annoying when you go out there to your customer and you shut the network down, 12 months ago, and you're back in 12 months' time doing something else. Yeah. When you can overlay all those data sets and look at asset ages and customer energy sort of flows, energy growth, customer behaviours, move in, move outs, all those sorts of things, you can start to get a picture which brings into it time as well. Okay, so time's an important factor. You don't race out and put a whole lot of batteries in now because it'll cost you a fortune. But I can fix that problem in 3 years' time because I know the price point on the battery is going to be this much. So you start to bring in another dimension. But bringing all that information for your IT, OT systems together is just such a powerful tool.
Yeah. Now, we've been talking about, bringing this information and these technologies together within, a utility company. And, now we've been talking about smart cities, smart transportation, smart water, energy water nexus, energy transportation nexus. So, I mean, these changing business models and regulatory structures, what does that mean for asset management? And how is it going to evolve as, more and more groups get involved in these efforts and there are more asset owners out there?
Well, I think there's clearly a coordination or collaboration aspect to it. In any city, as you said, there's multiple infrastructures. There's an electric infrastructure, there's a water infrastructure, there's a transportation infrastructure, et cetera, communications. So there's an opportunity to, once again, combine data to try and optimize either work that's being performed on the various infrastructures, so you don't have to dig up the street 3 times in 6 months, or
Like
things,
my street,
things that
yes.
really annoy people. But more importantly, kind of then going beyond that, what can you do with that data that you might not have thought of doing previously? This might be a little bit of a tangent, but it kind of implies the idea of putting quite a bit of this data in the cloud and giving wider access to it than you would just within your organization.
Yeah.
I know there's always going to be kind of security and privacy concerns in doing that, but I've personally observed a major shift just in the last, let's say, 18 months in the willingness to put some of that data in a cloud and make it under, certain, schemes of, making sure that people have the right authorization to view it, but, being a lot more open with that data than organizations have been in the past. And I really think that, that's kind of maybe the next wave that we're going to see is kind of a wider group of stakeholders that are interested in the assets, and then looking at kind of what types of collaboration can you foster by being more transparent with that data.
Yeah, those are great points.
Yeah, absolutely. The coordination with Telco, for instance. In our areas, we have some problems that we don't have reach. And what's our communication solution for smart meters and those sorts of things? When's Telco going out there? What are the councils doing with the developments? That example I gave you before about the engineers coming back with a lower cost. They did say, but in 5 years, Ian, we're going to have to build that 66,000 volt line, and we're going to have to put a new zone substation in there. So we've been able to defer it for 5 years. I said, why? Because that infill area there is going to be infilled by the developer, and that's going to create so much load at a ADMD of 5 kilowatts per lot and all this sort of stuff. So, well, why don't you engage with the council? Why don't you engage with the developer? Why don't you get them to put batteries in? When you start to bring all that information, share it with the community and the people who are investing in the towns and the cities, and you do it in a coordinated way, everyone's going to benefit. The customer will benefit, the utility will benefit, the councils will benefit, the community benefits.
Yeah.
So I think it's very important to share the data. In our case, in Urgon, we were capturing 160,000 kilometres of data every year, 3D image of the whole network, every regional city and town. And the thing that frustrates me the most is the government quite hasn't got it yet and grabbed the information. They could be using it for agriculture, they could use it for planning, they could use it for gas, they could use it for rail, they could use it for road. We paid for it to be captured, and there are so many spin-off benefits.
Yeah, so it seems like, just access and understanding of the data that's available. Definitely. Great. Well then, so another area, we already talked about it a little bit. So we've talked about IT-OT integration from that technology standpoint, but there's also that people standpoint. So we talked earlier today about humanizing infrastructure and the importance of people involved in these efforts. And so one more slide I wanted to look at with some data here is just how well are these people and groups working together to move forward with this next generation of asset management that we've been talking about. And here you can see that people are generally positive. There's definitely progress being made. A lot of people noted that it's going fairly well, and we find in surveys that people tend to be a little bit more positive about their experiences. But it seems like there's definitely a little bit of work to be done to start to bring these groups together. So, what are you seeing happening? What are some utilities doing that are really leading the way and bringing all these different groups together that need to be involved?
Well, I think during your very opening comments when you were kind of going through the chaos index and some of that material, you had one slide also from the survey up there that showed kind of all the different groups that would be potentially involved in an initiative like this. And I think that's really key, is that if it's just one or maybe two groups or departments that are kind of running the show, you fall back into behavior that, it's my data, it's my area of expertise. I'm not going to share it as much with everybody else. Whereas, if you have a project or initiative or whatever around asset management that includes all those stakeholders, right? So starting with engineering, operations, IT, maintenance, customer service. You had the full list up there.
Yeah.
When I look at utilities that have formed groups that are driving asset management that include all the stakeholders, I think they tend to be the higher performers as opposed to the ones that view it more narrowly and have a smaller number that are kind of driving driving the initiative.
Yeah, definitely. Ian?
That actually surprises me a bit, but
You think it's too positive?
I think it might be internal looking. we're okay, you're not. So, and I guess that's what I've been saying all the way through. I think your energy side relates to your asset side, relates to your finance side and strategy. So, it's. I think you've got to be careful you don't get captured by process, and that's what I've seen in our previous organisation quite a bit. We put in some process that fixed a big problem we had. We had poles falling over roads into kindergarten, schools, those sorts of things many years ago, and we put in a solution. The funny thing is that that was 2002. About 2014, when I certainly had a closer look at it again, it's pretty much as it was back in 2002. So we were doing what we did really well. It was compliant, it met the regulations, but the cost was going up and up and up. And I just didn't see the group challenging themselves. When we had one of those innovation workshops, I did ask some questions. Well, give me this data. Tell me what the amount of sound wood on average on this species of pole in this location, etc. Some just basic analytics. And it wasn't there. They had to go and write it. So the process had captured everybody, whether it was transformers or power lines or, before that vegetation management. Our vegetation management went up to 104 mil from in the early days, probably about 40. We brought it back to 60 odd. But it needed intervention. It needed different views and different thoughts brought in. Anyone can say the company's working well because the process is working well, it's compliant and we haven't killed anybody and the energy is still on, we're meeting our reliability products, are regulators funding all this money for us to do it? Oh, it's all well and good. Well, the regulator just cut every distributor in Australia, not because of that particular reason, because they do think they're inefficient. And this is part of it. I actually think we don't challenge it enough and people get captured by process. So I think if you ask the question in a different way on that one, you get a different result.
You get different results. So how do we foster that innovation? I mean, we talk about these, things like energy storage. I mean, people just, they freak out over that. It's really exciting. These are exciting areas. But there are these things that are absolutely critical to run utilities and to, move to the next generation. How do you foster innovation, across those areas that are so critical?
I mean, I think there's only a couple ways that you can do it, and it has nothing to do with whether we're operating in the energy industry or any other industry.
Yeah.
The CEO of Direct Energy this morning said, it's unleashing innovation that's out there in your organization by not telling people what to do, but asking the right questions and letting them come up with the ideas or the answers. I think that's absolutely part of it.
Yeah.
But I think to Ian's point, you also have to as a leader you have to constantly challenge people in your organization to it's another form of asking the right questions, but it's asking for well, why aren't we doing this differently? Why aren't you basing your decisions on the latest data as opposed to just following a process that was put in place in some cases decades ago?
And I think some of it's a couple of things. Creating a safe environment. Utilities tend to be very conservative. So creating a safe environment. I've certainly seen some environments where it's not safe.
Yeah.
Certainly had that experience myself. At one stage with the ministers, given it was a government-owned organisation, we developed some technology. People didn't understand it, and it's proven itself many, many times over. But it was a difficult process to go through. It took a lot of risk. So very much in the organisation I was in, we were pushing that safe environment. You can take risks. Every so often, well, things will fail. They do. We've seen all the examples of that, but you'll also get it right. It's great to see our Prime Minister at the moment out there talking innovation, innovation, innovation. So he's now leading from the top. And I haven't seen that in Australia for so long. We're very good at digging things out of the ground and sending it to other countries, and we go through the crashes and the booms. I've experienced the boom in Queensland where we spent billions of dollars trying to keep mines on and ports and all those sorts of things. I kept saying, well, what's going to happen when the crash comes? And it's there at the moment, and we didn't innovate. So the Prime Minister is out there doing that. I also think engagement with universities is important. We don't use them well enough, and we're trying to engage with them more. And particularly they need to change their focus too. They would like to write things that are published, and that's where they get their credibility from. They often come in and tell me, here's a good solution that we think you need. Well, that doesn't actually fix any of my problems. Here's a big problem that's costing me $30 million. Now come up with a solution for that and I'll engage you. And the other, I would say, is and I perhaps hate to say it, but it is the age bias. Our utilities have got a very much older population. And some of the younger people coming through who actually are playing with technology every day and knows what it can do, and when they get to understand the business and understand the business problems and then are able to apply that knowledge to hook the two things together, that's when you really get some significant change happening. But you know, we don't have enough in that space. I think you've got to build your business with that resource and those sorts of people in there.
Well, you know, maybe I don't know if this is exactly on topic, but you know, I mean, ABB is you know, a large kind of old company that's been around for 125 years. So in many ways, demographically speaking, if you look at our workforce, it's a lot like utilities, right? And you know, I'm in the software product group, and we're always trying to kind of compare ourselves to other software companies. And you know, we've actually had to kind of adopt practices that maybe are not normal for a large power and automation company, but would be normal for a software provider. That, you know, internships from universities, hackathons that we run on a regular basis. I mean, all those types of things you have to do to keep kind of an innovative spirit within your organization.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's within the organization. I mean, influences from outside, bringing in different groups. That's great.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we have a few minutes left here, and I'd love to be able to take any questions from the audience. I believe we have microphones. I might have to go retrieve. So what questions are there? We'd love to get some questions. You know, any?
On the front.
Yes, right there. John Arnold.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. I'm John Arnold. I'm an analyst, and I follow a lot of this stuff. And I'm also well engaged in the telecom communication space, so the kind of asset shifts that they're going through are happening here. I wouldn't mind hearing a bit more on your view of what the role of the regulator is and needs to be, since the concept of an asset changes with the cloud and IoT, less need for physical infrastructure, but we can't send energy over the air yet, right? So we got to build something. So, but I'm curious to hear what role you need them to play and how on side they are with the kind of, you know, world you see that has to unfold.
You want to take a crack at that, Ian?
Sure. Look, I think regulators are different all around the world. I've spent a bit of time in the US with some regulators and in Australia, and observed what's happened in Hawaii and in the UK. I met with Ofgem. And the UK sort of CPI sort of approach has worked well for a number of years, but then they found that they had no innovation. They had no funds for it, etc. So they didn't fund the transformation of the industry. The Australian regulator, we get regulated now on revenue cap. It used to be predominantly price cap, so our revenue's set for 5 years. The company I ran was always that case. That actually provides a lot of incentive for us to go out and do demand management, try and defer investments into the network out in the future, make it more efficient. I know here in America a lot of it's ROE regulation, and that does drive different behaviours again. The other thing with the regulator is, we've got to recognise we're in a competitive world. I always say to our people, we're not a monopoly business, we haven't been for a while. Yes, we're the only ones that have the poles and wires, but there's different ways of getting energy. Either supplementing it, offsetting it, or totally being independent. So the extremities of what we do and where the regulator regulates is got to be pulled in, allowing competition around the side. We're having trouble in Australia at the moment. Retailers, people perhaps don't know, Australia's fully disaggregated. You've got merchant generators, which are generally connected with the retailers. You've got some small retailers, distribution businesses. Distribution businesses not supposed to own generation. They're now saying we can't own batteries. But if I sit here and show you that the NPV calculation of me doing a hybrid battery solution in a customer's installation saves my shared asset customers money and saves that customer money, why would you exclude me from doing that? So there's all these arguments about trying to protect an old business model that doesn't work, in our industry at least. And the regulation is generally trailing. They cannot keep up with the technology. So the argument about network operators, I met with New York Power, who's the regulator in New York? I've forgotten. There was an argument that the networks had to be separate to the network operator. Well, who's got the obligation to run a safe and reliable network? How can you operate the network independently from the person who owns it and manages it? So look, there are challenges in regulations. I think regulators need to move quickly. The market is becoming more competitive, so what is the centre and the core of what gets managed becomes more important. Competition at the end of the day is going to start to force people to do it anyway. You might argue, well, in asset management, the regulator's regulating that and there's no competitive forces. Well, I can tell you that's not the case in Australia. If we do not get prices down, we get more shift into the renewable space, impacts our business. So I think everyone's got to understand those forces and look at the regulatory frameworks within that.
Definitely some good points. Rick?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't hold myself up as a regulatory expert, but when I talk to people that I do consider to be experts in that field, I think there's a couple of common themes. One is that everybody, I think, is concerned that the regulators are not moving fast enough, and are kind of not really prepared to understand the implications of new technology adoption. Rooftop solar just being one example, or energy storage, or whatever. But I think the other trend that I hear frequently is trying to regulate based on outcomes as opposed to being more prescriptive about how you have to do something. And I think that does cross over to this idea that although there may be a monopoly for the actual kind of wires, if you will, because that's an investment that's been made over a long period of time, it's not really a monopoly anymore. You have other ways of providing power to homes and businesses.
Great. Excellent. Other questions? Yes. And this will probably be our last question here.
Sarah Talkington from Austin Energy Green Building. So from my perspective, asset management from the building side and on the customer side of the meter is pretty well developed, and we've kind of been waiting for utilities to figure out how to use their buildings as assets. And I feel like this movement of understanding their own infrastructure is a good step in that direction. Can you speak some to what we can anticipate there?
You're absolutely right. One of the key messages to everyone in the industry and the businesses, or the business I ran before, was understand the resources you've got available, and it's not all this side of the meter. For instance, we had 700 megawatts of load under control through audio frequency load control on hot waters and air conditioners and those sorts of things. It's an old technology. We couldn't switch it, we couldn't target, well, we could switch it, we couldn't target it well enough to the loads. When someone comes and wants to build a new substation, one thing I would ask is, are you using that resource effectively? Because that is reaching into the homes and the businesses, etc. And we do pay for it through the tariffs, but we weren't utilising it well. We have the highest penetration of solar in the world. Starting to change that conversation from, well, this is a big problem, having all this solar out there. We've got 1.4 gig, I think, in Queensland, to, well, that's a resource. Okay, now how can I just change a few things to manage that resource? What do we do with the inverters? What do we do with VAR control? What do we do with voltage? What do we do with the tariff structures? How can I start to deploy that resource? And of course, buildings have got generators on, and hospitals and those sorts of things, and we're doing some of that. But yeah, the customers, and this is where it gets back into the data issue, having information on your customer, having the analytics to say, well, that customer looks the same as that one, but that one uses twice as much. And that irrigator, that farmer over there, has the same product going out and the same, etc., but his power is twice as much as the other. Well, it's on a constrained feeder. Well, let's look at his pumps. Can we change those pumps? You know, engage with the business, understand your customers, give them value so they value the relationship with you. So, yeah, look, the resources beyond the meter is much greater than the resources on our side of the meter. So you need to be able to utilise them.
Right. And I think there's also an opportunity for utilities to kind of set an example with their own buildings or facilities.
Yes,
you know, I mean,
yeah.
every utility has an office building, sometimes multiple office buildings. They have control centers. They may have data centers. There's a lot that could be done with those facilities to, you know, kind of set the example for what is possible.
Absolutely. Well, great. Well, thank you so much. We're out of time, but this has been wonderful. Great questions from the audience, and thank you so much, Ian and Rick, for joining us.
Yeah, it was my pleasure.
So we have, I think, about 10 minutes here. We have some full reports of this study. You just saw a little bit of a sample here today. We have those available in the back of the room, so I'd encourage you to grab those. We have about 10 minutes or so before we pick things back up here in the Stateside Theater. So thank you so much for joining us, and please join me in a round of applause for our panelists. So great.